Hey, good morning and welcome to the virtual campus of New Day Church in Brandon, Florida. We're so glad you've joined us this morning. I have something very special for you. I want to begin today with a story, and then we're going to jump into this new series that we've begun called Who Is This Jesus Guy Anyway? You're going to love this. Now, if you're on Facebook, you know that each day you will have notifications come up under a section called Memories. Well, this past week in my Memories section, a picture of my younger brother Craig popped up. It was a picture that evoked all the feels, if you know what I mean. You see, 13 years ago, I received a call from a hospital in Oklahoma telling me my brother had been admitted and he was quite sick. Well, he was by himself out there, so I flew out the next morning and arrived at his room just after he had been told by the doctor that he only had a short time to live. Now, if you've ever been in a situation like that, you know how the shock and the devastation and the hopelessness just overwhelms you, doesn't it? Well, after the doctor left the room, my brother was very emotional, and I'd gotten very emotional. And we hugged there for a moment, and finally I just climbed up in the bed with him and just held him as we both just sort of cried it out for a few minutes. You know what I mean? Well, then after a bit, we both calmed down, and he got better, and we started telling stories and reminiscing about our childhood and good memories of the past. And all of a sudden he said this. He said, "Mikey, I think you need to preach me one of your good sermons about right now." And I'm going to tell you exactly how I responded to him at the end of my message today, okay? So you gotta hold that thought and wait, and I'll tell you the end of that story. We are in this series called Who Is This Jesus Guy Anyway?, where we are looking at who Jesus is. Not who we've been taught that He is necessarily, or who we think He is necessarily, but at who Jesus is according to Jesus, in His own words. In fact, 7 times in the book of John, Jesus describes Himself beginning with the words, "I am." Last week we talked about Jesus as, "I am the light of the world." The week before that, "I am the bread of life." Today we're going to look at 2 things Jesus says about Himself in John chapter 10, where He says, "I am the door," or the gate, "and I am the shepherd." All right, now watch this. Let me read a few verses to you. Jesus said, "I am the gate / door. Whoever enters in through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy, but I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." And then down in verse 14 of this chapter, Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd. I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me, and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep." Now, I think we would all agree that to be a shepherd, you have to have sheep. So I want to begin this morning by first of all talking about the shepherd's sheep. And you know, don't you, that you and me, we are likened to sheep in the Bible? I mean, figuratively, we are the sheep of God's pasture. And you may think, "Oh, that's so good, that's so sweet. I like that we are Jesus's warm, cuddly, snuggly, buggly sheep," right? But not so quick. When I was growing up, my grandparents had a few sheep. And I learned that, yes, they can be cuddly, especially the little babies, but they can also be cantankerous, ornery, even mean. And I'll tell you something else about sheep. They stink, and they poop a lot. Especially the little ones, when as a pastor you're trying to hold one on your lap and give an illustration in your Sunday morning Easter message. You find out they really do poop a lot. That's a story for another time right there, but it's true. So when we read that God chose to be our shepherd, He did so knowing full well that all our relationship with Him would not always be delightful. Our relationship with Him would not always be warm and fuzzy. For instance, let me give you a couple of examples. Check this out. Sheep are not real smart. And for those of you who don't believe that, think about this. How many sheep have you ever seen in a circus? If you've ever been to a circus, Barnum and Bailey Circus, maybe when it came to your town, if you did, you saw trained lions, no doubt trained elephants, horses, dogs, right? Did you ever see a trained sheep? Well, I can answer that for you. The answer is no. Heck, you can train a donkey, a seal, a bird, a cat. You can even train a flea, but not a sheep. How many of you have a dog that's trained? Sit, and it sits, fetch, roll over, play dead, right? Did you know the only way you can make a sheep play dead is to shoot it? And that trick only works one time, and then it's like game over, right? So I'm saying that they're not real smart. So as a rule, and that's just as a rule for sheep, which is not the greatest news for us, being that we are God's sheep, you know? So let me ask you a question. Could it be that at times we are not nearly as smart as we think we are? I think so. Think of it this way. A sheep gets lost easily. And guess what? So do we. And I'm not just talking about when you go on a trip, you men in particular. I'm not just talking about that. Listen to these words from Isaiah. We are all like sheep and have gone astray, each of us turning to his own way. You see, a sheep will often wander over here and graze, and then they'll go over there and graze, until after a while they get so far away from the fold, they're lost. And the shepherd has to set out then to find that sheep and bring it back to where it actually belongs. Well, the same thing is with us as God's sheep. Oh, I think I'll go this way in life. That's going to make me happy. Or this relationship, man, that's the guy I need. That's the woman I need. That's going to make me happy. Or over there, that looks like fun. That looks like fulfillment. No, maybe I should try this right here. And all of a sudden, all those things happening in our life, all those choices that we're making, all of a sudden our life is in disarray. We wind up in turmoil rather than peace and abundance. So sheep are not very smart. The second thing, sheep are very stubborn. Look at someone there in your home or wherever you are. Look at someone and say, I think this one's for you because it sure can't be for me, right? Sheep are stubborn. I read a story about one sheep trying to go into a crevice between two rocks, and the sheep got stuck. And the reason why is because when it was trying to get in there, seeing that it couldn't get in, it was too stubborn to back up, and it just kept going and moving until it got itself stuck. So you never hear a sheep go beep, 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 right? There's no beeping or backing up. They just go until they're so stuck they can't go any farther. Now, how many of you know someone like that? Like that friend, for instance, that's always broke. You got that broke friend? Golly. Well, I've got a couple of people come to mind immediately. They're always broke. They got the credit cards maxed out, and they call you up, and they're all depressed, and they're all whining. Oh, I'm just so broke, I have no money. I don't know what I'm going to do. Will you meet me at the mall so we can talk about it? The mall? Really? That's where the broke person with the credit cards maxed out needs to go? I don't think so. Or that friend that comes along and says, why do I always end up with these kind of guys? Why do I always wind up with these kind of women? Which, by the way, says more about the person asking that question than it does his or her love interest. Would you agree? So, okay, let me give you one more. Sheep have no defense system. They don't take care of themselves well. Think about this. Most every other animal has some sort of way to defend themselves, don't they? Cats have what? Claws, exactly. The picture that's coming up on your screen, that's when that's bath time for me and our cat, Gracie. That's what I got to wear because of her claws. She can protect herself. Some animals have teeth, some have horns, some have fangs, some have wings to fly away. Others can change colors to blend with their environment. But the sheep, pretty much defenseless. All they can do is say to their enemy, back off. That's I didn't think I could do it that way. That's all they can do, which is one more reason that a sheep needs a shepherd, and so do we. All right, not only the shepherd's sheep, let's think about this. the shepherd's love and care for his sheep. There are any number of things a true shepherd would do for his or her sheep, but I want you to hone in on two of them. First of all, a good shepherd guides his or her sheep. In verse 4 of chapter 10, Jesus says, when he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, the shepherd, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. Now think about that. The sheep follow the shepherd and they know his voice. The first church I was in, when I was in that first church, I met my first real missionary really up close and personal. The first one I actually got to know. We had this mission week emphasis that all the little churches in that area where we were serving, and all the little churches were having this mission emphasis, and so a number of missionaries came in. They were on furlough from being wherever around the world, and they came in, and every night they would go to a different church and share their story. I will never forget this one couple and their story. Both he and his wife had master's degrees. They were both engineers in a large and growing company. They both were making a big six-figure salary at a time. Now, this is a long time ago. This was at a time when I thought $1,000 a month meant that I had hit the big time, right? And so they had tremendous incomes, and they told the story of how they believed God had ordered their steps and led them to give up everything they had to go help people in a third world country. In the telling of their story, they recounted how they lived basically in a little hut with a dirt floor for 2 years, the first 2 years they were on the field. They fetched their own water from community blocks away, until sometime later when a water system was developed. It was a life completely antithetical to the one they had back in this country. But here's what he said over and over. This is what stuck with me all these years. He said, God led us out of where we were into the most beautiful and satisfying place on earth. Not just in the physical sense, he said, but emotionally and spiritually as well. And he always ended his talks to these churches with this. He said, we are so glad we listened to his voice and followed him, our gracious God, our guide. Did you get that? Our gracious God, our guide. Isn't that great? Jesus the shepherd is our guide. Now, in Jesus' day, there were times when the shepherd was indisposed for whatever reason. Maybe there was a death in the family, or the shepherd was sick, or whatever. Well, when that happened, a stranger called a hireling or a hired hand would have to step in and tend that shepherd's flock. But the problem with that was, if the flock had to be moved from one field to the other, for instance, the sheep would not follow the newbie because he was not their true shepherd. Look again in chapter 10, verse 5. Jesus said, but they will never follow a stranger. In fact, they will run away from him because they do not recognize a stranger's voice. So because the sheep would run away if a stranger tried to lead them, that man would get behind the sheep and he would have to drive the sheep. A true shepherd would never do that. A true shepherd would always be out in front, leading and safely guiding his sheep. And the sheep always followed that shepherd. So here's the question. Since Jesus is our shepherd, how does he guide us? Or even better still, how do we know when and where God is guiding us? Could I just say that the longer I teach and preach, the more convinced I am that we are really making that answer to that question way too hard? Well, I want you to look again at verse 4. When he has brought out all his own, he goes on ahead of them, and his sheep follow him because they know his voice. And verse 14, I am the good shepherd, I know my sheep, and my sheep know me. Get this now. The sheep follow because they know Jesus and they know his voice. Often someone will say, Pastor, I can't hear God's voice. I don't know God's voice. How do I know when God is speaking to me? But remember, first off, Jesus said His sheep, that's you. He said His sheep know Him, and His sheep hear His voice. That pretty much settles the issue right there, wouldn't you say? Well, the second problem, though, is not that we can't hear Him or that we don't know when He's speaking. The problem is either we don't believe He is speaking because we deem ourselves, let's say, not worthy, or it is that we just don't believe what we hear. Would you like to know how to really hear God's voice? It's very simple, except for those who are steeped in traditional church teaching. It's a little more difficult for them. But for the rest, it's real simple. The way you learn to hear God's voice is to simply just get out there and be. That's it. Just go live. Just go do life. Just go enjoy life. And what you will discover is that because God's Spirit lives in you, you will instinctively know what to do, and you'll know where to go. Now, someone would remonstrate, well, what if I sin? What if I sin? Could I just put a great big old OMG with an exclamation point on you right there? Because so what if you do? Just keep being anyway. Because believe it or not, sin is not your issue. Sin is not really your problem. You being righteous and fully forgiven already and believing that, that's the issue. Because I promise, if you can get that one thing, that's when the Jesus life happens. And when the Jesus life begins to happen more in you, guess what? Sin happens less in you. So basically, get out there and enjoy life. And when and if you get a check in your spirit or a reason to pause at something, all right, just avoid it, at least for a bit, until you can think that thing through. And as you do that, you will immediately recognize what you should do and what you should avoid. And most importantly, you will realize the power of God in you to help you make that recognition. So I guess what I'm saying is quit overthinking everything. The truth is that most of us right here today, most all of us, we have enough Bible and good teaching in us to last 3 lifetimes. It just comes down to trusting that God is going to be God in your life and that the shepherd will in fact guide you, because He will. So the shepherd guides, and one other thing I want to share is that the shepherd provides. In verse 7, the Bible says, "So Jesus said again, I tell you the truth, I am the door for the sheep. All the people who came before me were thieves and robbers. The sheep did not listen to them. I am the door, and the person who enters in through me will be saved and will be able to come in and go out and find pasture." The shepherd would build a pen of sorts at night. It's called the sheepfold. And this was an area that he would bed down the sheep. It was most often a circular rock barrier that was high enough that the sheep could not jump out and difficult for a predator to jump in. And just to make sure, the shepherd would put brambles or thorns on top of all those rocks. And then at night, the shepherd himself would serve as the door. He would lay across the opening where the sheep come in and go out. So he would become the door. All right? You seeing the word picture? Jesus as the shepherd and as the door. The people understood that. And again, the sheep could not get out with him over that crossing the door, and the enemy could not come back in. But something else. Here's what the shepherd did each evening, and this is wonderful. This is beautiful. Every evening he would come in from a day's grazing, and he would sit down in the middle of that sheepfold that he had built, and he would call the sheep one by one so that he could tuck them in. You know how you tuck your children in? That's what the shepherd would do. He would caress the sheep, he would rub the wool, he would probe deeply into each of the sheep's wool, checking for wounds and sores and abrasions. Because on those mountainsides, rubbing up against rock, going through sticker bushes, all those things, it was easily for cuts and bruises to appear on a sheep. And so the shepherd would work with that sheep until he found those abrasions. And then he would take out his oil flask and massage it into the wounded areas. Do you remember in the 23rd Psalm where David said, "Thou anointest my head with oil"? That's this picture. The shepherd would pour that oil in there and he would rub it in those wounds of the sheep. Think spa time for the sheep, right? Well, the shepherd knew everything there is to know about each one of his sheep. And in fact, the shepherd always named his sheep. And when he called them, it wasn't just, "Hey, you come here," or "Hey, sheep, come here," or grab a sheep and pull it over. All he had to do was call that sheep by name. And he did, and the sheep would come to him. Now watch this in verse 3. "The doorkeeper opens the door for him, and the sheep hear his voice. He calls his own sheep by name and leads them out." Isn't that something? Let me tell you about my first trip to Israel. I went over there with a really dear friend of mine in our church out in Oklahoma. His name was Pete. And he had a daughter and son-in-law who were living in Israel, and they were going to be there for a year. And so they invited him over, and he invited me to go with him to see Israel, to tour, and all that kind of stuff. Well, now this was the time, this was way back there. There was a TV show, some of you are not old enough to have any idea what I'm going to tell you about, but the rest of you do. There was a TV show called Dallas, and it was a very popular weekday series. I think it was on every Sunday night, maybe, I can't remember. But it was just simply called Dallas. I think they've done some remakes in recent years. It was a very popular show, and there was a villain in the show, a family member, named J.R. Ewing. How many of you remember J.R. Ewing with his big cowboy hat? I've got a picture for him right there for you, so maybe that'll trigger your memory. Well, anyway, so that show was popular. Well, we walked down through the old city that first day, and the vendors were just going crazy. Pete wore his cowboy hat and his cowboy boots, and as he walked down there, all these vendors trying to sell us things were yelling at him, "JR, JR, JR." And he took pictures with people, all that kind of stuff. I mean, they knew he wasn't JR, but he was dressed just like JR, and that's all they could identify with. But get this. At one of our stops as we were touring, there was a shepherd with his sheep out back. And we went around, and we're going to ask the shepherd if we could take a picture. And shepherds over there in Israel, even in this day, are very notorious about turning you down. They don't want a picture. But this man got very excited about taking pictures. And we found out later the reason why is because one of his sheep was named, guess what? J.R. J.R. Ewing, Ewing, get it? J.R., pretty creative name, I think. Listen, can you imagine God your shepherd speaking your name? Isn't that just the greatest thing? So what does all that mean? It means that our shepherd provides for us in every way possible. It means he knows us. He knows every hurt, every pain, every struggle. It means he's aware of every tear that spills down your cheek. And not only does he know, he does something about it. In John chapter 16, he says, "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble, but take heart," Jesus said, "I have overcome the world." The shepherd is the overcomer, living in you every moment through everything you experience. In your moment of pain and suffering, when you're down and almost out, whatever the situation, the shepherd is there. He will never leave you. He will never forsake you. Well, I got that call that my brother was very sick and admitted to the hospital, and I flew out there immediately. He was quite emotional, as you can imagine. We both were, and so we were hugging, and I crawled up into the bed with him and just held him for a long time, and we sort of cried things out. Well, we got finished with that, and as I was telling you earlier, we started sharing some stories and experiences and memories we had of kids growing up, and it got to be a good situation there. We were both calm and at ease. And my brother looked up at me and said, Mikey, I think you need to give me one of your good sermons right about now. He kind of laughed a bit, but then I saw he was serious. And I said, Craig, I can't even remember one of my sermons right now. I said, how about this? Would you settle for the 23rd Psalm? He just took my hand in his and closed his eyes. So I began to quote that psalm. I said, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. But I couldn't go on. I started weeping. So I tried again. And I said, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And again, I couldn't finish. Finally, I got determined and I sort of bit my lip and took a deep breath and I tried again. I said, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And I started crying again. And my brother squeezed my hand and he looked up at me and he says, you know what, Mikey? I think that's really all we need, isn't it? I mean, that's the whole thing right there. The Lord is my shepherd. He says, so I don't have to want. Isn't that right, Mikey? And he was right. That was enough. And that is enough for all of us. Because when Jesus is our shepherd, listen, we have it all. We do. So let me give you this challenge as I close. This week, every time you are confronted with a problem or a need or a fear or a question or a hurt, just quote this out loud right then. Because the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not lack. He guides me safely, He provides for me fully, and He cares for me deeply. Will you do that? Will you just pray that out loud when things are bad for you? I shall not lack because the Lord is my shepherd. He guides me safely. He provides for me fully. He cares for me deeply. Memorize that, all right? Just like you're memorizing a scripture, memorize that, and every time you need it this week, you pray it. And you see what this shepherd will do in your heart and your spirit as He calms you, as He assures you, and as He gives you a vision about the plan He has laid out before you. All right, so that's about all the time we have today. I need to quit right there. Could I just pray for you before we sign off? Father, I pray for everyone watching today. Would you let them know and feel and sense, and even in their physical bodies, that you are the shepherd, guiding them, providing for them, meeting every need of their lives. And thank you for being a shepherd who is always there, who will never leave and forsake us. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen. Listen, if you have a prayer request or a need or something in this message provoked a question, let me know, will you? You can PM me on Facebook, send me a personal message on any social media venue, or go to our website, newdaychurchbrandon.org, and there's a place you can send me an email right there. I would love to hear from you. So I pray you have a good week. I pray the shepherd is active in your life and that you sense that every moment of every day this week. And until next week, I'll see you then. Bye-bye.